Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Module 4, The Causes of the Great Depression. So we're going to start off our discussion today by talking about this book, Business Without a Buyer, written by economists Hatchings and Foster. So in 1927, they write this book and hypothesize that the consumer demand, so how much people want products, is not going to keep pace with how many products are being produced. So we talked about how in the 1920s, there's a rise in consumerism, but there's also a rise in efficiency in how many goods can be produced. So they predict that there's going to be too many things and not enough demand, so people are money to buy those things that are being produced. So they predict that this era of prosperity in the 20s will end in depression because we are overproducing. And this is the first time it's sort of hypothesized that demand and how much people want products is tied to how well the economy is doing. So I'm going to have you pause the video here and answer your first question on your notes. What do you think the problem will be if there are not enough people to buy all the goods that are being produced? What do you think will happen? So take a minute to predict on your notes. Let's also talk about real wages. So this is a new concept in the 1930s, and it's kind of what it sounds like. So real wages, what can people actually afford? What is their real wage? This is also tied to the term of purchasing power. So how much power do people have to purchase things? So, how much people are making is not increasing as fast as industrial output. So how much can be produced with the Industrial Revolution and the rising consumerism is not keeping pace with workers' wages. So too many things, and the wages are not keeping pace with it. So there's more things being made than people can buy. So productivity increases by 52%, but real wages are only increasing by 27%. And this is throughout the 1920s leading up to the 30s. So speaking of that, right, too many things being produced, so we call this overproduction, right? So this is caused because there's more efficient ways to produce things in factories, but we talked about the prices are staying the same so that business owners can make profit, a stronger profit, but the wages for the workers is not increasing and keeping pace with how much is being produced. So there's not enough people to buy the things being made. So that is going to cause eventually businesses to fail. So we're talking about wages are not keeping pace. One factor leading to that is the decline of the power of unions. So you have like big business owners like Henry Ford, some of them ban unions. So we have the American Federation of Labor, which is a big national union. So they refuse to include unskilled workers in the union. So that's like immigrant people who are working in factories just doing the same tasks over and over. You don't need a skill for that, so they're an unskilled worker. And the union is trying to protect skilled workers and an education and knowing how to complete a task or a trade. So that's a huge portion of the population. So a lot of immigrants and other unskilled workers who are not protected by unions and, people who can advocate for higher wages. And this comes from, people with skills not wanting a machine or unskilled laborers to take their jobs. So this is your second question. If you take a second to pause and answer, what role can a union play in increasing wages, and why would that be important for wages to increase? So moving on, we also have this issue of underconsumption. So we talked about how there's more and more things being produced, but less people are buying them, and it's tied to the fact that their wages are not keeping pace with the increase in production, and the prices are staying the same. So you also have this maldistribution of wealth. So that's the people at the top. So the rich, their disposable income and how much they can spend is increasing by 75%, but you have so many Americans with $0 in savings. So that's a maldistribution. The top 1% of the nation holds 20% of the wealth, whereas the other 99% only has 80. So the people on the top, that means they're really rich, and the people who are on the bottom are more poor in comparison. So this creates a problem of purchasing power, right? The 99% lack the ability to buy things. They lack purchasing power because the money is not distributed equally throughout society. We also have sick industries contributing here to the Great Depression. So these are older industries. So they're used to make goods in factories, but these are more of our natural resources. So mining, lumber, coal. So they employ a lot of people, but it's at low wages because it's physical labor. And we'll talk more about why it's called a sick industry. But essentially what a sick industry is you have farms, for example, or, a mine. They're overproducing. So the price that they're getting for their natural resource is decreasing or staying low. And so that means, right, they lack purchasing power. They lack real wages, right? They want to buy more things, but they're getting a lower price. So their solution to that is, well, we'll just produce more things. We'll just extract more from the environment, right? We'll cut down more trees. We'll farm more. But that makes the price even lower because, right, the greater the supply, and if the demand stays the same, the price is going to decrease. So their solution is, well, I'll just, cut down more trees to make more money, but it actually lowers the price, and therefore they get less profit. And so that's why it's called a sick industry. You're producing more and more, but you're making less and less. And so that happens specifically, and mainly to agriculture. So it's the sickest industry of the 1920s. So this happens to agriculture specifically. So agriculture is the sickest industry in the 1920s, and not like sick like it's good, sick as in, right, producing more and more, making less and less money. And a ton of Americans are still farmers. They're not participating in the consumerist culture of the 1920s. That was sort of reserved to cities and places with higher populations. So the 1920s is not a part of this like prosperous vibe of the 20s. Something that also contributes to agriculture being the sickest of industries is the motorized farm vehicle, which is a fancy way to say tractor. So the tractor sort of helps speed along how farms can be more productive because you don't need as much physical labor to cultivate the crops. So you can plant faster. And farmers went into debt to buy the tractors. So you kind of have this perfect storm brewing to contribute to agriculture being the sickest industry, where farmers are going into debt. You have less people buying fresh produce, so you have canned goods, and then less demand in Europe because of the war and the reduced population there. So again, to kind of recap, the issue with agriculture and other sick industries is there's a surplus, right? So with the tractor, they're cultivating more things, the price decreases, and then they're like, oh my gosh, I'm not making as much money because the price is lower. Let me produce more and more, but that makes the problem worse. So this leads to a depression just within the agricultural industry. So you're going to answer your third question here if you take a second to pause. What is wrong with growing too many crops, and what potential problem could that cause? So what's wrong with having too much food? We also have the concept of a global economy, particularly after, in the wake of World War One, where the U.S. economy, it gets tied to other countries' economies. So the health of our economy is tied to the health of the economy in Europe, because we're lending money to the rest of the world, and we're sort of acting as a world's bank. So we'll talk specifically with the Dawes plan, how our economies are tied. So the Dawes plan is that Germany, right, is found responsible for starting World War One, and so they're ordered to pay reparations to repair their relationship with European countries. They owe those countries money. They also have to pay back the U.S. as well. But America decides to lend that money to Germany to help pay ourselves back and other countries back. Does that make sense? Not really. But we were trying to stop World War II, but World War II still occurs. We also have the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which could have helped, especially the agricultural industry. So a tariff is a tax. We make it more expensive to have goods come in from Europe because we're trying to protect things that are made in America. But we could have benefited from the competition in terms of trying to regulate and, equalize prices if we had competition with other European countries. We talked about in last module about the stock market crash, right? So reducing the amount of credit, so people buying things on credit, because banks, if you remember banks shutting down. So banks are lending out less money. We talked about real wages and income isn't keeping pace with production. And we just had some structural weaknesses in our economy. And America learns from the mistakes of the Great Depression. So, right, if banks didn't have enough reserves, then they were forced to shut down in a bank run. So we know that we'll talk about how that is not the case today, and it's fixed during this era. We have sick industry, so we don't have mechanisms in place to regulate prices if we have this issue of producing more and more, making less and less. We'll talk about in the Depression how that is fixed, and this problem of purchasing power, that wages are not keeping pace with production in the economy, and that people's wages aren't increasing at the rate it should. So people lack ability to buy things, right? So there's not enough demand to keep the economy going. Lots of companies overproducing, and if people don't buy their stuff, they're not going to recoup their losses. So therefore, a lot of businesses are going to fail. So by 1932, all of the progress we made, the industrial gains of the 20s have been wiped out. So you have a lot of factories that are built running at a portion of what they could. So, right, for example, the car industry, it's running at a fifth of its capacity. The investment in the stock market reduces significantly. And just to illustrate that we're in a depression in 1931, the Empire State Building opens. It's supposed to be like this, huge office building to signal prosperity, but the elevator doesn't go past the 42nd floor because no one has rented out that space. Because there's a lot of businesses that are failing and, don't have the ability to rent fancy office space. So just to recap, you'll recap this in your assignment, but the causes just quickly of the Great Depression. So one, overspeculation. These first three were covered in Module 3 as causes of the Great Depression. So overspeculating and buying stocks on margin. So a lot of people participating in the stock market and betting that stocks would go up, but not having the cash to prove that, and just more people participating in the stock market and us not really knowing how it works. So again, that leads to the stock market crash, where people start selling off their shares in one day. And if a lot of people are selling in one day, that's a crash. The value of a lot of companies goes down. and that is what's known as a crash, stock market crash. And we talked about how that leads to a panic and bank runs where people try to get their savings and cash out of the bank. If they go to the bank says, we don't have your cash on hand, whether a rumor or true, and they're forced to shut their doors if they don't have enough reserves to pay the people who bank there. Right, and because banks lost money in the stock market as well. We also have the problem of overproduction. So overproduction and underconsumption are tied together. So we're making too many things and not enough people are buying them. So the companies that produce the things don't get enough profit. They can't keep up with wages. So that's lack of purchasing power. So too much stuff, not enough people to buy it. So then companies suffer. They make less profit. And so companies start failing if they're not keeping up with how much they're producing. And then wages did not keep up with the amount of production. So people lack purchasing power. They lack the ability to buy the things that are being made. And we also talked about sick industries. So this is, separate from factories, but farms in particular who are producing more and more things, but then they make less and less money. So the prices are lower, but they try and recoup losses by making more and more things, but they make less and less money. So therefore, they are a sick industry. So great. That's the end of this module. You can use these slides to help you fill out your chart. Thank you so much.